Good morning, InfoSeCon. So next talk is Agentless Device Security, Making the Invisible Visible with Armis, one of our great sponsors. We have Chris Dobrik, the VP Product Marketing at Armis, and as well as the CISO, Curtis Simpson from Armis. Gentlemen, good morning. Thank you for being one of our great sponsors. I'm looking forward to this talk, and well, good luck.
Awesome, David, thanks so much, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to allow us to speak to you today. Curtis and I are going to spend some time talking to you about a number of key security challenges that we see in the marketplace today, and talk about how to address them. So once again, my name is Chris Dobrik. I head product marketing at Armis. I've been here just about a year now, but have spent the last 15 plus years in cybersecurity, and I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Curtis. Curtis, why don't you say hello to everybody and give them everybody your background?
Good morning. Thanks, Chris, and thanks for joining us, everyone. So Curtis Simpson, as was mentioned, CISO at Armis, been with Armis for just over a year now, and prior to joining Armis was global CISO at Sysco Foods, and like Chris, have been in IT and security for about 20 plus years now.
Awesome.
And looking forward to the talk.
Cool. Thanks, Curtis. So, and everyone, we'll get a chance to answer any questions along the way here as well. But let me set the stage for what we're going to talk about today. And fundamentally speaking, we're going to talk about the growth of devices that are connecting to our networks. And in many ways, this is intuitively obvious to everyone on this session here. The key thing that I wanted to hone in on was the growth of things that we like to characterize as unmanaged or unagentable. And this is particularly salient when you take into account the security stacks that we've built over the last 10, 15, 20 years have been really targeted at traditional managed devices, largely speaking, PCs, laptops, servers, the data center infrastructure, web infrastructure. In recent times, we've had a number of things connecting to the systems in terms of smartphones and tablets, some managed, some unmanaged, some in the form of BYOD. But other areas that Curtis and I spent a lot of time looking at is effectively the red bar here, which is the host of devices that are connecting to the network now that, again, we classify largely as unmanaged or unagentable. But it's things like, voice over IP devices, it's the network infrastructure itself, it is point of sale systems, printers, HVAC systems, smart lighting, and a whole host of other things. I know, Curtis, in your role at Sysco Foods, you had some very interesting things that you were able to find on the network that would kind of, would fall into this classification as well. So perhaps you can give the audience shed a little light there.
Yeah, so really what helped me highlight that this ratio had been significantly changing within our environment at Sysco was the discovery that we made when we were investigating an incident that turned out to be a benign incident, which was good, but we found that there were safes, and this was about 4 years ago now that we discovered this, safes in our cash and carry areas of our warehouse that were now connected directly to the internet. Those local facilities had determined that sharing a code for the safe wasn't working, money was disappearing, etc., and they wanted to sign up for a cloud service that would allow for some level of authentication back to the safe. With over 350 locations around the world, you can imagine that as we discovered the safe, we discovered many other more bizarre devices and things, quite frankly, that I often describe as traditionally having been benign, were now entirely connected. And what we found was that there was very little coming into our environment that was not connected. And it was interesting, right? So not only were we driving our own strategic initiatives and introducing IoT for customer use cases and such like that, but our vendors were connecting all of their devices for their own benefits, everything from vending machines to the safes themselves, to even our forklifts were now connected for a number of different use cases. And then, of course, you got to consider elevators and all those other types of devices. Everything was connected in any of our newer facilities. And then again, as devices were replaced, they were once not connected and now were connected.
Yeah, and the other interesting thing, Curtis, is not only were they connected to the intranet, but many of them had outbound connections to the internet, like the safe, for example, right? And yes. So the key point that I wanted to leave you all with this particular slide is just the growth is massive in terms of the devices, but they are, after all, endpoints that have a processor, they have memory, they have the ability to be breached and attacked, quite frankly, and we'll get into some of the details of that momentarily. But let me transition from that fundamental problem to talk about traditional security programs and practices and how some of these things are broken by this notion of all these new devices coming on board. It starts with just the notion of, asset inventory, and can I actually see everything? Network segmentation, do I have the ability to adequately isolate things? I would argue that network segmentation as a security practice is insufficient today, particularly when we see breaches that allow for relatively easy lateral movement across the network. And it goes on to vulnerability management, et cetera. But again, Curtis, from your perspective, you were taking a look at your traditional security programs at the time, and then you realized you had a challenge, across this entire continuum. So I'd love to get your further commentary to share with the audience and your experience as a CISO and a practitioner.
Yeah, you bet. So comment on a few of these things. So asset inventory. So the environment I came from was very much what could be described historically as an IT environment and an OT ICS environment. So two distinct environments, historically disconnected, more recently, much more connected, right? Between devices and connections and everything else. What we were really discovering though is a few different things. Is we realized that none of our asset discovery tools actually worked effectively in our OT environments, and nor did they work effectively in discovering IoT. Even beyond that, what we found with both asset scanners or discovery scanners and vulnerability scanners, both combined, is that they could cause more damage, and actually we did cause more damage than an attacker could have even caused years ago, trying to deploy those traditional technologies into those environments. And the reason is because so OT devices are often old, right? 10 to 20 years old in these environments. IoT devices are new, but purpose-built. They're not multi-use devices like PCs and laptops and servers and such like that. They're usually built for a couple specific outcomes. They do those things well, but they're not expecting other communications, and they fall over when they get them. So that's one of the greatest challenges there. And then as I think about network segmentation is part of a strategy, but it's not the strategy in entirety. And there's a couple of reasons for that. A lot of times the tools used to establish the segments don't really understand a lot of the devices within those segments. And then what we also have to remember is that if we don't know what's in the environment, we're really only segmenting what we know. We still don't really understand what the rest of the landscape looks like, because a lot of those discovery efforts don't work when we're talking about IoT and OT. And then lastly, incident response. So this actually probably caused us to move in a different direction and to adopt new technology more than almost anything else. And I'll tell you why. Because more and more we were finding that attacks were involving IoT, and we had no visibility into what those devices were, the context of those devices, how they were typically interacting with the rest of the environment. And what we were finding is our IR efforts were being more so spent on identifying devices in the context around them than responding to the incident. And obviously in 2020, that just doesn't fly.
Yeah, which is an interesting segue, Curtis, to the things that we have seen. 2019 and 2019 and 2020 have been interesting from a vulnerability and a breach perspective as it pertains to these unmanaged and IoT devices. Just some news clips from 2019 alone, and then Curtis and I will talk about some more recent things in 2020. But Microsoft had highlighted breaches of what they termed simple IoT devices, but quite frankly, it was attacking IP phones and exfiltrating data from those. Our own researchers last year had discovered a couple vulnerabilities. One was dubbed Urgent 11. Urgent 11 was 11 zero days that were found in the TCP/IP stack of VxWorks. And VxWorks is the real-time operating system that's in a whole host of industrial and medical and IoT devices. We subsequently discovered that it wasn't just VxWorks, but a number of other real-time operating systems as well that had these particular vulnerabilities. And then late last year and in February of this year, we disclosed a vulnerability that we dubbed CD-Pwn. CD-Pwn is actually a set of 5 zero-day vulnerabilities that are in the Cisco discovery protocol. CDP CDP is in virtually every bit of Cisco kit on the planet. It's used primarily to, map network devices, so the devices know about one another. There's some rudimentary management capabilities that are built in, things like negotiating power levels for IP phones to switches. But our researchers found that that CDPone, there were some vulnerabilities in the protocol itself, and that those could be exploited for things like breaking segmentation and moving across VLANs and whatnot. But suffice to say, there's a whole host of things that have been happening. And Curtis, you've been watching what's been going on recently in 2020, and you might want to talk a little bit about the CISO alerts that we saw just this week, as well as in the last several weeks, focusing on healthcare and manufacturing.
Yeah, it's really interesting, right? So very recently we saw the NSA and CISA advise or really warn us of the perfect storm in the OT and ICS environments, and that they're actively being attacked. They're highly vulnerable. In June and July of this year alone, there were 75 vulnerabilities disclosed around OT and ICS equipment, actively being targeted, continued levels of attacks around the world, often starting with social engineering, resulting in the installation of initial malware, the further installation of additional malware, reconnaissance, and then full deployment of ransomware across a lot of these landscapes. Now, as we look more recently, and I'll actually touch on one of the ones that's noted here, Microsoft warns Russian hackers are compromising secure networks, blah, blah, blah. This is an interesting one, and I'll talk about a couple more after this, but this is an interesting one in that we recently saw APT28, at least it's believed to have been APT28, take down the New Zealand Stock Exchange every single day for a week. Why that's interesting is it actually connects back to this story here, where Microsoft disclosed last year they've been tracking APT28, and it realized they've been targeting, and in many cases it exploited 1,400 different enterprises. It's interesting because they have been exploiting those enterprises to compromise IoT and build a massive botnet with ever-growing capabilities. Guess what botnet has been affecting that New Zealand Stock Exchange? That botnet is huge now. That ultimately means that that botnet is formed of many devices that are unbeknownst to enterprises and consumers have since been compromised and added to the botnet. Most recently this week, we've seen similar advisories from the NSA around attacks against healthcare. So combination of a couple different pieces of malware following that same typical playbook, but actively targeting these environments and affecting not just traditional systems, right? A lot of landscapes, like when we look at a healthcare environment as an example, many of the devices that deliver healthcare services are running Windows and Linux. So as a ransomware event hits that environment and starts moving laterally as they do to affect as many systems as possible, the unfortunate fact is that these attacks end up affecting every device in the environment or every type of device, and more often than not, more healthcare and medical devices than traditional IT devices, as we've even seen with many recent attacks ourselves.
Yeah. And I neglected to mention, Curtis, that the NSA put out the top 25 vulnerabilities that are being exploited by Chinese nationals. CDPone was number 24 on that list. So, we are seeing these types of vulnerabilities being exploited as a point of entry. And leading to other things like ransomware and malware spread. So just wanted to set the context for, the magnitude of the problem that we see with these unmanaged and IoT devices. And then it's further challenged by the, fragmentation of the overall security systems that we have. Again, I would argue that the security stacks that we have built over the course of the last 10, 15 years plus have been focused primarily on those managed devices or perimeter security, but the number of tools that we're deploying today and the somewhat siloed nature of them makes this challenge even more exacerbating. And so it results in, the inability to have a good single source of truth where you can actually manage and control policy. Again, Curtis, I know you lived this firsthand as a practitioner, so I'd love some additional color from you.
Yeah, our environments are complex, right? And more complex than ever. So we've got many different tools in our own stacks. We don't just have the cloud. I know there's this misconception often on the vendor side that everyone's migrated to the cloud. No, we have the cloud too. We also still have the legacy environments. Or a large percentage of folks may be working remotely now. They have new devices they've never had before. The landscape is complex, right? And it's not just about managing risk in a traditional environment anymore. It's about managing risk across all these SaaS solutions, all these IaaS environments, our traditional hosted environments, our on-prem virtual assets that are used for non-production and such like that. It's about understanding this risk across the board, and more than anything else, being able to truly continue to protect what's most important to us, which in many ways is harder than it's ever been without an understanding of what that landscape looks like and the risks that could affect those things. And again, a lot of it is because of this complexity.
Yeah, precisely. And so it makes it difficult for, for security practitioners to actually answer a number of fundamental questions today. And, virtually every conversation I have with customers and prospects around the planet really starts around this. It's do you trust your CMDB data? Is it accurate? Do you think you have a complete handle on every single thing that's in your environment? By and large, they'll say, yeah, we have a pretty decent understanding of our, managed devices. But when it comes to the unmanaged things or things that we classify as unagentable, the answer is often, more often than not, no. And so, your source of truth for just that basic asset inventory becomes a challenge. And then there's a whole host of other things and questions that you need to have answered along the way. I know, Curtis, when you went to your teams previously, you actually asked them all these questions, and were they able to address them, with the tools they had, or if they could, how long did it take, and how were you able to represent that to, the board, the rest of the organization and the business behind the business?
Yeah, this was painful. So in some cases, we're able to answer these questions, like how many laptops do I have, but without a lot of confidence, right? Because the challenge that we were always facing is that none of our discovery solutions were highly effective. I won't name all the different solutions so as not to slight anyone, but we had 5 or 6 different products in totality, ranging from vulnerability scanners to typical Active Directory, active asset reports to other very intentional asset discovery tools, both that we owned and our service provider owned. And here's what the reality was, is that we were spending hours and hours and hours every month just answering these questions as opposed to managing risk. And a lot of it came down to the lack of visibility. And as I talked about those 5 or 6 different solutions, when we look at that or take a step back from that, what that involved is a resource actually sitting down, creating scripts to pull in all that data, dedupe the information, and then create a new, more up-to-date asset list. And quite frankly, it changed by the time they were done, because we were using these scheduled scanners to help us find most of what we were discovering, and our environment was just changing too rapidly. And when we talk about IoT, then we really get into the rapid change aspect, because IoT was being introduced everywhere, constantly, whether it was for those customer use cases, those new devices being brought into our facilities, or otherwise. And we were losing more and more visibility to it all the time, even though they were connecting to all these other devices. So what we were finding was our asset inventories were not complete. We were struggling to answer questions all the time, like, do I have endpoint protection on every single one of my devices? That should be easier to answer than it is with traditional solutions, but it's tough, right? It requires many different network integrations, different layers of visibility, the ability to stitch that information together, and another team owns the CMDB. And the reality is in most cases, that other team has only been somewhat concerned about fixing that. I know my experience has been the resources associated with fixing the CMDB are very limited. They're not the most skilled resources in the operation normally, and it's a side project or a side gig for someone who has 700 other side gigs. So there's a lot of challenges. There's not a lot of data that we can rely on from other teams and other tools. We've all come to the conclusion we have to do this ourselves, but it just takes too long with our traditional solutions, period.
Yeah. And so just recapping, what we just discussed thus far, right? I don't think anybody in this session would deny that there's a massive growth of devices connecting to the networks, and that the overall security environment is exceedingly complex. So in many ways, we're restating the obvious to the teams there. But then the question becomes, how do you address this problem moving forward? And so I spoke previously about, the nature of these devices, unmanaged and IoT devices. One of the key things is you can't put traditional security agents on them. So, that method of, securing and managing these devices it goes out the window. Another key element of them is many of them can't be scanned for fear of tipping them over. And this is often the case in industrial environments. We've actually seen cases where scanners have been pointed at devices in a production manufacturing environment and actually taken out the manufacturing environment by disrupting it. And then you have to be able to do this in a completely seamless and frictionless way. And so the way we at Armis look at the problem is, okay, if I've got all these massive number of devices that can't take an agent, I have a number of traditional tools in my environment that don't adequately address that. How, in fact, can I address this problem moving forward? And that's how Armis was born and how it works. Fundamentally, what we do is we connect into your environment to all your existing IT security and management systems, things like the network where we can glean information about communications. We can fully discover, we can identify the devices, classify them, then understand and give them a risk profile, and then compare them to our device knowledge base on our threat detection engine to determine what is anomalous behavior and what is not, and then take actions to remediate. But Curtis, the platform itself is pretty powerful. Why don't you spend a few minutes just talking about the key elements of the platform and how they work?
Yeah, you bet. So let me just quickly touch on the knowledge base first that Chris just mentioned. So the knowledge base is a powerful thing and a true differentiator, and it'll apply to the next points that I make. When Chris mentions a knowledge base, we've built an overall database, a crowdsourced, anonymized database of over 300 million unique assets or devices rather, at up to 8,000 points of attribution. So Armis truly understands what these devices look like, how these devices behave, and that's important in the context of how the overall solution works. So first and foremost, Armis will discover all networked assets in an environment, meaning that if a device is communicating over the wire, wireless, or even over the air like Zigbee, Z-Wave, Bluetooth, 2.4 gigahertz, proprietary OT protocols, etc. If the device is communicating in any such manner over a network in any capacity, we will find it. We'll tell you exactly what that device is. And then based upon the knowledge base that I mentioned, we already have an understanding of what normal looks like. And not just in your environment, such that we've potentially baked in malicious activities into what normal looks like. No, across all implementations. So we were touching on healthcare risks. As we look at healthcare devices like an infusion pump, the normal behavior of an infusion pump is based upon every single one of our implementations and how that same infusion pump works within those environments. So we truly understand these devices, which allows us to not just tell you what they are and what they're communicating with, which is powerful enough, particularly the latter, but we give you insights into whether these devices are acting abnormally, if there's risks, vulnerabilities associated with these devices, and those can include advisories around these devices, right? Like recently with Section 889, advising that, or Section 889 ultimately requires that anyone servicing the federal government is not using devices from 5 Chinese manufacturers and approximately 290 of their affiliates, and is also not using devices that would have included any of their OEM chipsets from any of those manufacturers. So we not only provide visibility into abnormal behaviors, risks and vulnerabilities, but again, even those advisories, and provide our customers with immediate insights within seconds into which of those devices are actually at risk, are affected by those advisories, et cetera. Now, if we do see that abnormal or malicious behavior, there's a number of different things we can do to facilitate response. So obviously we integrate with SIMs, any SIM that's out there, we can integrate with the corresponding SIM. We integrate with SOARs, but we also integrate with the network plane and other solutions like a NAC. So whereas a NAC is traditionally, I often use the analogy of a bouncer with a NAC. A bouncer is checking the ID and determining whether or not you should be allowed into a club. As long as the ID looks good enough and you're of the right age, you come in. If that person that was let into the club destroys that club, it doesn't matter. That bouncer's never going to turn around because they're only checking IDs, right? It's the same general concept with NAC traditionally. Well, we make NAC do a lot more. So in that same analogy, if that person's disrupting the club, you're able to isolate that individual and then deal with law enforcement or whatever else. Same general concept here in an enterprise environment. We're able to isolate a device that is acting abnormally and maliciously, et cetera, either manually or automatically, whether it's through a person, through a SOAR, which becomes a powerful thing because NAC becomes a hammer to truly manage risk in the moment, as opposed to trying to proactively assess a device and hopefully proactively manage that risk, et cetera. And all of this, as Chris noted earlier, which is incredibly important when we talk about those IoT and OT devices, it's done passively, continuously, and in real time, right? So if you identify that malicious behavior, that the alerts are triggered in real time, you can act on it, et cetera. Pretty powerful stuff from end to end.
Yeah, without a doubt. And one more anecdote. You talked about infusion pumps, Curtis. This is a pretty broad audience here, so I wanted to give an IT use case. So, the story I tell here is often, a tablet is not a tablet is not a tablet. So a tablet, traditionally speaking, is a content consumption device that has a connection outbound to the internet, and you can do a whole bunch of stuff with it. The interesting thing is when you apply it to, say, the tablet being used as a control room for a conference room, there's on the one hand, a profile of a tablet would be, such that it's normal for that tablet to be streaming data, outbound to some destination on the internet. However, if in that particular use case, it is designed to be a, running kiosk mode, handling a, controls for a conference room, streaming large amounts of video outbound to the internet is not exactly the sort of behavior that one would expect or should be seeing from that particular device. And so the point that Curtis was making about the device knowledge base and the understanding of baselines, we can actually see this type of behavior, apply our knowledge of what known good is, determine if that behavior is anomalous, and then subsequently make a remediation decision from there. So lots of different things that are available in the platform to examine and understand. Curtis, I know many of the folks on here are security practitioners and use the various security frameworks. For the purposes of this discussion, I just want to spend some time on CIS controls and where Armis covers. But if you can make some commentary in general on how you use the various frameworks in the past and moving forward, that would be great.
Yeah, so CIS is one of the most commonly applied frameworks, right? Because it really starts with visibility, and I think we all align to that. And the reality is that Armis truly provides that visibility to help you build the right strategy. So as we think about the CIS controls and understanding, mostly what I think is most important is the left side of this, understanding what you've got, and then downstream from that, understanding what's normal, et cetera, and having the ability to control that. But more than anything, understanding what devices are out there, how those devices are being used, their opportunity to disrupt the things that are most critical to you. Once you have that understanding, not only do we rise up to and align to CIS controls and many other frameworks and allow you to build out those frameworks as makes sense for you, but what I will say is we truly deliver on that visibility layer that allows you to establish that effective strategy for your environment based upon what's most important and what you have to protect.
Yeah, without a doubt. And so when we go into environments, typically that's the number one question that people are trying to answer. They don't know what they have in their environment or don't have a complete handle on it. And so Armis will go in and we'll work with you to determine, okay, what do you have in terms of complete asset inventory in your environment? And from there, we build what is your complete software inventory. We can look at and break down not only the complete set of devices from a hardware perspective, where we can things that, the traditional managed devices, but that extends into unmanaged and IoT, but also the software versions that are running on them to get a complete understanding of version numbers, et cetera, where they compare those to the individual device and what is on it and what its version numbers are. And then ultimately mapping that to risk factors and vulnerabilities. So we have connections back to CVE, the CVE databases, et cetera, and can generate risk scores that against those devices, map them over time, and then even drill down to the individual levels and take remediation actions. But Curtis, you were an active user of this product prior to joining Armis, so perhaps you can talk to the audience about how you used Armis at Sysco.
Yeah, when we talk about this visibility layer, it was really exactly as I said, understanding what was in the landscape first, but then going back to what's most important. And then now that we had an understanding of what's in the landscape, IoT, OT, IT, we could then build the right strategy, implement the right protection measures, monitor accordingly, and truly deliver on the end-to-end. But it started with visibility and allowed us to crawl, walk, and run through a highly effective strategy to protect what mattered most to the business. Yeah, that's really it.
Awesome. And as I mentioned before, we can evaluate that entire inventory of hardware and software and understand the overall risk and be able to make determinations as to what to do from there. But Curtis, this is the fun part of the presentation where we get to go in.
Chris, I hate
yes,
to
David.
interrupt you, but we are at a hard stop for an hour. So how can people get in touch with you if they want to have a further conversation about Armis services?
They can contact us at armis.com/demo and come in and get to us, or you can reach me directly at christopher.dobrek@armis.com.
Awesome. I hate to cut you guys short, but we do have hard stops. So just a final reminder to everybody to visit the vFair Platform Lounge. And we will be back, I think, at 2:30. We're breaking for lunch, and then we have the keynote with Ira, and then we'll be back for track 2 around 2:30. So thanks a lot, guys.
Awesome. Thanks, David. Bye now.